that the only way to get to heaven is by what Jesus has done for us. But there's a humorous fictional story told that I want to begin this morning's message with that I think you will enjoy. It's a story about 4 men from another country that went to heaven, and they were not Christians and they didn't know much about the Christian faith or American culture. And in this fictional story, Peter meets them at the gates of heaven and says, you know, we've decided to make an exception for one day, and if you can explain what Easter is about, you get to get in free today. So the first man, he's really confident, and he said, oh, I know what Easter's about. I've heard of this American holiday, this Christian holiday. He said it's when families all get together and they watch football, and they eat bunches of turkey. And then they have a turkey coma. And Peter says, I'm sorry, but you didn't get it right. The second guy, he's a little less confident. He steps up and said, I think I know what this Easter's about. He said, children dress up in scary outfits. And they go all over their neighborhood saying trick or treat, and then they get cavities. Peter said, I'm sorry, but you don't have it either. The third one said, I think I know. He said, Easter is about Jesus, right? And Peter said, oh, this is good. He said, yes, Easter, Jesus, born in a manger. Little man in red suit, fat with beard. People exchanging gifts. And Peter said, I'm sorry, but you don't have it either. Finally, the fourth man says, well, I'm not very confident, but I think it's about Jesus and the resurrection. And Peter said, this is really good. How he died on the cross, and he didn't deserve to be there, and then 3 days later he came back to life. Peter said, you got it. And the guy continued. And then when he came out of the grave, he saw his shadow and he went back in for 6 more weeks. Well, I tell that silly story to make this point. A lot of people think they know what Easter's about. But Easter's not just about the resurrection. That's the central part. But Easter is actually about hope when hope appears impossible. If you have ever in your life gone through an experience or a period when you couldn't imagine how God could get you through it, Easter is your story. Because everybody at some point in life goes through experiences that they just don't know how to make sense of. When things look absolutely hopeless. Anybody been there? You don't even know what to do. Listen, if God could bring Jesus back from death, your problem and mine, it's no big deal. That's why the story of Easter is so significant. Because it's a story about hope. It's a story that challenges all of us to look beyond ourselves to someone greater. To look up, not merely out. It's easy to assume that the people of Jesus' day understood the story. That his disciples should have understood what was coming with the cross and what was coming with the resurrection. But quite honestly, if you look at the story, they didn't. We understand it because we're looking backwards. We know how the story ends. You ever gone to the movies with someone and you've already seen the movie? And they get to that moment when everything looks hopeless and they're freaked out because they just don't know how it's going to end, and you're sitting over to the side saying, it's going to come through. I'm telling you, you really don't have to worry. I know how this one ends. Truth is, because we know God brought Jesus back, we don't have to know the precise details of our story to know that just because things look impossible, it doesn't mean they are. Let's read a passage this morning, Luke chapter 24, please, verses 13 to 37. If you've got one of our Bibles, you can follow along. If you've got yours, feel free to read along. I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. Here's what it says. That same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. But Jesus kept them from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing so intently as you walk along?" They stopped short, sadness written across their faces. Then one of them, Cleophas, replied, "You must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened there the last few days." "What things?" Jesus asked. "The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth," they said. "He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. Then some women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone just as the women had said." And Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, you find it so hard to believe all the prophets wrote in the Scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would suffer all these things before entering his glory?" Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the Scriptures the things concerning himself. By this time they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey. Jesus acted as if he were going on, but they begged him, "Stay the night with us, since it's getting late." So he went home with them. As they sat down to eat, he took bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. Suddenly their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And at that moment he disappeared. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and explained the Scriptures to us?" And within the hour they were on their way back to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 disciples and others who had gathered with them, who said, "The Lord has really risen. He appeared to Peter." Then the two from Emmaus told their story of how Jesus appeared to them as they were walking along the road, and how they recognized him as he was breaking the bread. And just as they were telling about it, Jesus himself was suddenly standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. But the whole group was startled and frightened, thinking they were seeing a ghost. Would you pray with me, please? God, open your word to us this morning that we may understand. God, speak to us and encourage us with the hope of the resurrection. In your name I pray. Amen. Amen. This Easter Sunday, here's where I want to begin. And if you've got your bulletin and want to follow along, this is the first point in your notes. God's often invisible to us. The day was Easter. The people mentioned here, his followers, they've been following him for a long time. And now that he's been put to death, they simply don't know what to do. If you've ever experienced the death of someone extremely close to you, then on some level you understand. When someone you care about deeply dies, you don't know how to go on. But it was even more than that. They had believed he was the Messiah. They had believed he was going to make everything right that had been wrong. And as they traveled along doing what people normally do when they can't make sense of things, they talked. Isn't that what you do when you don't know how to make sense of things? You find somebody and you talk. You try to make sense of it. This is what's going on, and this is how it happened, and trying to make sense of this thing. And that's what they did. And as they're walking along, talking among themselves, this stranger walks up, someone they don't recognize. And he engages them in a conversation. And verse 17, he says, "What are you discussing so intently?" And so they say, "Are you the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's happened? How the religious leaders were threatened by Jesus and they put him to death? They don't understand how Jesus couldn't have heard, and they don't understand what's taking place. So everything going on, none of it makes sense to them. They're confused by why God would allow this terrible thing to take place. They can't make sense of it. I want you to understand something. If you're a follower of God, it doesn't mean you're going to understand everything. It just doesn't. Sometimes God allows bad things to happen to good people. We've all seen it, haven't we? And sometimes bad things happen to you and me. And it's often not that we're doing something wrong, it's just sometimes horrible things happen. In fact, look at this next statement in your notes. God allows things that surprise and confound even his closest followers. These people who have been following Jesus, they're some of the really close ones. They are absolutely, to put it in present terminology, they're completely bummed out about this. It doesn't make any sense. How could this happen to Jesus? But he's dead. It doesn't make any sense. They are confounded by how a good God could have allowed something so horrible to happen. These men, or men and women, we're really not told. We're just told they were walking along the road. These people have probably been following him for close to 3.5 years. They understand that he was taken down from the cross afterwards and he was buried in a borrowed tomb. And they tell Jesus the story of how some of the women from their group have gone to the tomb early that very morning, and when they got there, it was empty. And Jesus is walking along with them. It's a classic example of how Jesus is sometimes there with us, and we don't recognize it. We don't know it. We're not aware of it. You know, I've gone through some experiences in my life that I didn't know how to deal with, and at the moment, it seemed like God was nowhere to be found. You ever prayed and it seemed like your prayer hit the ceiling and bounced back at you? Anybody ever been there? This is kind of exactly where these people are. Everything they believed has now been called into question. The one they had pinned all their hopes on is dead. And now these reports are coming back that maybe he's actually alive, but get real. Have any of you ever had a dead friend come back to life after being buried 3 days? Doesn't make sense. We don't understand how it is even possible. And they didn't either. They wanted to believe, but they didn't know how. Because it seemed so impossible. And then Jesus walks up and engages them in conversation. The only thing was, we're told in the Scriptures that their eyes were blinded so that they couldn't know who he was. That brings me to the second point that I want you to jot down in your notes. God's always at work, even if we don't see it. They were involved in a conversation with Jesus himself, but they didn't know it. One of my favorite books of the Bible is Esther. Anybody remember what's unique about the book of Esther? Of all the 66 books in the Bible, it is the only one that God's name is never mentioned. It's just not there. There's not a God. There's not a Jesus. There's not a Lord. There is nothing there that directly refers to God. But what's so amazing about the book is when you read it, God is there every step of the way. He's working. And frankly, that's often the way it is in our own lives. Have you ever gone through a particularly difficult time and it seemed like you were all alone, and then you got to the end and you look back and realized he had been there all along? That's exactly what these people were experiencing. God was there. Jesus was there. They were going to make more sense of it a little bit later, but at the moment, it just didn't make sense. And that brings us to the second major point in your notes. God is always working among us. As I mentioned earlier, Jesus joined them on this 7-mile walk between Jerusalem and Emmaus. He's there to help them make sense of the confusing things that are happening. In fact, he comes up to them and says, "What's happening? Explain it." And interestingly enough, you know what they do? They tell Jesus about Jesus. About what they knew about him. They explained that they knew he was a prophet. That he was mighty in word and deed, and that God obviously worked through him in amazing ways. They confided that their hopes and dreams, in fact, had been that Jesus was the Messiah, the one who was going to redeem the nation. It was impossible to miss the disappointment they were feeling, the sorrow in their voices, as they told Jesus how the Jewish leaders had conspired to have him put to death. And then they told him the latest twist in the story. Some women from their group had that very morning gone to the grave and hadn't found the body. Some men had gone to investigate, and they didn't find Jesus there either. They want to believe he's alive, but it just seems so impossible. Let me give you another principle that relates to them and to us. God sometimes helps us understand what he's doing in ways we would never expect. They never imagined for a moment that the one they were speaking to was Jesus himself. Jesus' question to them about what they were doing was intended to draw them out and get them talking about what they didn't understand. It was his way of helping them come to terms with his death and with his resurrection. It gave him the chance to begin explaining to them the truth that they were going to eventually come to treasure. He was answering their questions about himself, yet they didn't know it was him. He was helping them come to terms with his death, yet they didn't know it was him. He was helping them move from despair to hope, and yet they didn't know it was him. He was their teacher, giving them the answers they needed, but they didn't know it was him. Here's the reality. Look at the next statement in your notes. Some of God's most awesome work is done when we don't recognize it's him. God's always at work, and he's always there, but you and I may not see it at the time. Jesus was able to take the comfort that they needed and provide it for them. He was answering their questions and helping them come to terms with seemingly unanswerable questions. Those questions only intensified when they heard the report from the women that Jesus was actually alive. And he took the prophecies of the Old Testament. We're not told which ones, but I can imagine maybe Isaiah 53, which talks about the crucifixion hundreds of years before crucifixion was even invented, as if it was being described by an eyewitness at the foot of the cross. You see, Isaiah was written in about 700 BC. Crucifixion was developed between 3 and 400 BC. In fact, many scholars, critical scholars, have said, well, Isaiah was obviously written after the cross. But when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls and they dated the scrolls, they date from way before Jesus. This is prophecy that this was always God's plan. Always. It was unimaginable. That's the reason why when people were reading it, until Jesus came and demonstrated it, it never made any sense. Wouldn't you have loved to have been there to heard the conversation? Wouldn't you have loved to be there to hear Jesus describe his mission? Why he had come, what he had accomplished, and how he had fulfilled all the scriptures? Wouldn't you have loved to just be another member of the party listening to Jesus describe Jesus? What an amazing experience. And that brings me to the final point. God is meant to be shared. Now notice what happened when they arrived in Emmaus. Jesus acted like he was going to go on, and they begged him to stay and eat with them. And Jesus takes bread and he blesses it, then he breaks it and he gives it to them. And suddenly at that moment they recognized it was actually Jesus. Notice the statement. Suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him. The implication is that up to that moment God had kept them in the dark because it needed to be this way. I know sometimes when we're going through the darkest hour, we can't see anything but darkness. Anybody ever been there? I went through a period one time where I was depressed. And I could see nothing but the bad. Anybody ever been there? Everything I looked at looked dark. I mean, I was pastoring at the time, my goodness. But everything I looked at, it looked black. It looked bad. Something good would happen, I'd find bad in it. Anybody else been there?
Yes.
These people, that's kind of where they were. And then Jesus comes and he flips the light on. He expands it. He explains it. Suddenly, they had been kept in the dark, but suddenly the light comes on. They've been prevented from recognizing him, but suddenly they recognize him. At that moment, they had a decision to make. Would they remain in Emmaus where they had just arrived after traveling for 7 miles? Would they go back to Jerusalem the next morning and tell about it? But actually, if you'll look closely, you'll notice that at that very moment, They decide, although they have just walked 7 miles, they leave that night and walk the 7 miles back to Jerusalem because they've got news. Jesus really is alive. I want you to imagine for just a second that you hear that I have died. You come to Kudus and you see me laying out here. You go to the graveside. You stay. You watch him put me in the ground. And then you discover, because I come to your house and freak you out, that I am actually still alive. How many of you think you would tell somebody? Thank you. How many of you would wait a week? How many of you would be getting on your cell phone immediately? Take a picture. There you go. Hey, the dead pastor, he just dropped by for a visit. I've got pictures. Exactly. This is such amazing news. They don't wait, even though they just walked 7 miles and it's getting close to evening. They take off to go back to Jerusalem because this is such amazing news that they can't keep it to themselves. What they heard about was so important. It had to be shared. It had to be taken care of. It had to be dealt with. How many of you can remember when your kids was growing up and they would get some money and they would go to the store? And how do we describe little kids with money? We say it. Maybe your kids didn't do this, but I can't imagine they didn't. You ever had a young child with money and it just burns a hole in their pocket? They'll even buy something they don't want just because they can. Right? It just has to be done right that moment. Right? Your kids that way? All kids are that way. But at least they go through a stage where they're that way. Most do. That's what these people were with this truth. It was burning a hole in their pocket. They just had to tell somebody. And so that's what they do. They go back to Jerusalem. When they get to Jerusalem, they find their way to the 11 disciples, Jesus' other followers. However, before they can share the wonderful news they've heard, they hear that... Do you see it there? Verse 34. The Lord has really arisen. They heard this from the others. The Lord has really arisen. He appeared to Peter. Now here's the principle that I want you to get from this, and this is in your notes. God isn't only working in us, He's also working in others' lives. That's one of the really cool things I want you to understand. Although you are in a spiritual journey, so is everybody else. God's working in you, but He's also at work in others. That's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the case for Christ. Because although the case for Christ is going to strengthen your faith, you and I have friends that God's already working in. And if they hear this, some of them, this experience is going to become part of their spiritual journey. Their faith is going to be built up. There may be people who join us in heaven because this becomes part of their spiritual journey. Because God isn't only working in us, He's also working in others' lives. Frankly, that's one of the great reasons we share our faith with others. Because God's not only working in us, He's working in others. Now, let me be really clear. When I'm talking about sharing your faith, I'm not talking about shoving something down someone's throats. That just doesn't work. When somebody tries to shove something on you, what is your reaction? You run. If it's a telemarketer, what do? Click. I mean, we all do that. If they, I try to be polite, actually. I thought, what would it be? How do you love a telemarketer like you love your neighbor?
Talk to them about Jesus.
Never actually thought of that, Johnny. That's a good idea, I guess. But usually I'll be very polite and I'll say, I'm not interested. Thank you for your time. And then they just keep going. And you know what I do? Because I told them. I tried to be polite. But I'm not going to stay on the phone and have him tell me about something that I'm never going to buy. Understand? But here's the deal. God's at work even in those little experiences of life that you and I can't imagine. The case for Christ is important because it's based on the facts. And the facts that can strengthen your case and help you in your spiritual journey. Do you think God was pleased with these folks from Emmaus coming back to share their faith? I want everybody to nod their head yes. Absolutely. And you know how we know that? Actually, look at verse 35 if you still got your Bible open. Then the two from Emmaus told their story of how Jesus had appeared to them as they were walking along the road and how they recognized him as he was breaking the bread. And just as they were telling about it, Jesus himself was suddenly standing among them. Can you imagine? At the point where they finally say, and then Jesus was there. And suddenly, Jesus is there. You think that made an impression? Well, if somebody had just been telling you about the dead pastor and how he's alive, and in your mind you're thinking, I'm sorry, I was at the funeral. I saw them put him in the ground. And suddenly, I'm there. Well, that's the reason you have verse 37. They thought he was a ghost. Now let's be honest. If you had seen me buried and I suddenly showed up, would it freak you out? Normal reaction. But the reality was, he was alive. He was there. In fact, on one occasion, remember how he showed them that he was real? He put out his hands and said, Thomas, put your fingers in the holes. Here, pulls back his robe. You can put your hand in the wound. It's really me. It's really me, Thomas. I'm really here. It's such good news that it is meant to be shared. In fact, look at the last statement in your notes. The truth about God is so important that we must not keep it to ourselves. Allow me to conclude with a story that I hope touches you as much as it did me. I'm a pastor and I love to tell stories. This one I heard over 25 years ago and I still remember it, which says something. A little boy named Jeremy. Jeremy was 12 years old, but he wasn't. Let me explain. Jeremy had a terminal illness and it affected not only his body, it also affected his mind. And although Jeremy was 12 years old, he actually was in second grade and he wasn't even getting the second grade lessons. It was sad. Jeremy was obviously ill. He was a tragic little boy, but very sweet. He just couldn't keep up. His teacher, Doris Miller, would sometimes get frustrated with him. His parents sent him to a parochial school. But Doris knew that of the 19 children in her class, Jeremy just wasn't going to get it. She said there was an occasional moment when it was like it all clicked. And for just a moment, there would be some clarity of thought. And he would get it, and then as suddenly as he got it, he lost it. And he drooled, and he drug his foot, and he just didn't fit in. Besides, he was 12 and everyone else in the class was 7. So Mrs. Miller called Jeremy's parents and said, can we talk? And so they came and she told the parents, you know, I don't mean to be unkind, but Jeremy doesn't fit. He's big and they're little. They're learning and he's not. I think you need to find more appropriate education for Jeremy. And the mother cried. And the father explained. He said, we live in a rural community. There are no schools for Jeremy. If Jeremy's not here, we will have to keep him at home. Would you please let Jeremy come to class? He loves the children. He loves you, Mrs. Miller. When the parents left, Mrs. Miller thought about it. She talked to the staff about it, and she decided that although 18 children were being affected by Jeremy being there really was nothing else that she could do. She decided to just make the best of it. In fact, she thought, here I am complaining, and these parents have a dying child who has been entrusted to me. And so she thought, I'm just going to make the best of it. Spring came. Jeremy, it was Jeremy. They began to prepare for Easter at the parochial school. The teacher began to talk to the children about Easter. And as children do, they got excited. Easter eggs and bunnies and the resurrection. Because it was parochial school, the resurrection was a big part of the story. And so Mrs. Miller gave the children an assignment. She said, would you please take these Easter eggs, and she had an Easter egg for each child. And she opened it up and she said, I want each of you to take an Easter egg, 19 children in her class. And when you get home, fill it with something that represents new life, the true meaning of Easter. The children were ecstatic. They couldn't wait to take their Easter egg home and fill it with something. That evening, Doris went home and she got very busy. The sink in the kitchen clogged up. She called the landlord. It took a couple hours for him to get someone there to fix the sink, and then she had to run to the grocery store, and then there was a vocabulary test to prepare. And she meant to call Jeremy's parents because she knew Jeremy wouldn't get it. But she got busy and forgot. And so the next morning, all the children came back and they all brought their eggs in, and she had set an Easter basket on the front table, and the children all came up and they deposited their Easter eggs into the basket. They did math, and then the big moment arrived. The teacher opened the first Easter egg. Inside was a flower. And the teacher explained that just as the flowers come up in the spring after they have been dead and after you can't see them, they come back to life, and it represents Jesus and the new life. And the children took it all in. Another Easter egg contained a little rock with a little bit of moss on it, and the teacher explained the same thing. Another Easter egg contained a plastic butterfly, and the teacher explained on second grade level metamorphosis, and how the caterpillar climbs into his cocoon, and how he dies, and yet he comes back to life, and there is new life, and it's wonderful. And then she opened the fourth egg, and before she even got it more than open, she knew it was Jeremy's. She opened up the Easter egg, and this is what it contained. Nothing. She immediately inside of her head began berating herself. Why did I get busy and forget to call Jeremy's parents? And she didn't want to embarrass Jeremy. She sometimes got frustrated with him, but she didn't want to embarrass him. And so she set the Easter egg down and reached for the next, and Jeremy spoke up. Mrs. Miller, aren't you going to talk about my egg? And Mrs. Miller looked at Jeremy with a look of compassion, and she said, but Jeremy, your Easter egg is empty. And Jeremy said, Mrs. Miller, wasn't the grave empty too? And Mrs. Miller cried. And she explained to the children that the empty grave is what Easter is all about. When there has been no hope, the hope of an empty grave. The story concludes that 3 months later, little Jeremy died. And at his funeral, his parents explained why there were 19 Easter eggs open in the casket. Because you see, the reality is, our hope is that we do not stay dead. Our hope is that when we die, that's not the final chapter. That's just the transition. That's what Easter is all about. That's why Easter is such an incredibly, incredibly big deal. Because although We may not see how God is working. He is always working. And He just might use a 12-year-old handicapped child to teach you the most important lessons, because sometimes they just get it. If you need the hope that I've been talking about this morning that Jesus' resurrection offers, I want you to know that you can invite Him into your heart in the next moments. He is the one who came to earth as a baby in a manger, lived 33 and a half years, died a death, and then actually the acceptance of Jesus' sacrifice is proved by the fact that 3 days later, He came back to life. Would you bow your head with me, please? God, thank you for sending Jesus. Thank you for dying on the cross for us, Lord. Thank you for not staying dead. Thank you for the hope that we share because of what you have done for us. In your name,